The high country was parched that summer, the kind of dry that cracked wagon wheels and left a man's tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth before noon. From the ridge above the Popo Agie, the land rolled away in long, bone-colored swells of sage and sand, glinting under a hard white sky. It was a land made for silence and wind, a land that took the measure of a man and gave back only what he could hold. Elias McCrae had held it longer than most. They called him Elk-Horn, a name earned long ago when he rode into Bent's Fort with a rack of horns strapped across his shoulders and a smile half hidden in the shadow of a beard the color of iron filings. In those days, the 1,820 seconds, maybe the 30 seconds he had trapped beaver along the Green and the Yellowstone, run with Bridger, seen the shining mountains in their rawest state. He'd eaten mule meat half-cooked in a snowstorm and slept under hides so stiff they could have stood on their own. But the beaver were gone now, mostly. The trade that had once filled Street Louis counting houses and London hat shops had thinned to memory and debt. The old trappers were dying off or turning into guides for the emigrant trains that poured west like a flood. Civilization had crept into the cracks of the wilderness, leaving men like McCrae standing at its tideline, uncertain whether to turn back or be swept along. He chose neither. Instead, he dug himself into the earth. The cabin he built that year was unlike anything in the Wind River Valley. While the other settlers hammered pine boards into neat rectangles and raised white smoke from their stovepipes, McCrae took a spade to a hillside of clay and gravel and began to burrow. The slope faced east, catching the morning sun but sheltered from the punishing west wind that came rolling off the mountains. He carved out a single long chamber 12 feet wide, maybe 20 deep, with a low roof of cottonwood logs chinked tight with sod and mud. The front wall, set with a single door of rough-hewn planks, faced a view of the open basin. Above it, the grass grew back quickly, so that from a distance the roof looked like a patch of the hill itself, alive and green. A stone chimney poked up like a stubbed finger. Inside, the air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and smoke. It was, as one neighbor said, a mole's den fit for a badger. McCrae took no offense. He had lived among worse. When word spread that the old trapper was building a cabin underground, the settlers laughed. They said he'd gone soft in the head from years of solitude, or maybe from the snow-blind winters he'd spent in the mountains. Some came to watch, leaning on their shovel handles, passing whiskey between them as they made their jokes. "He's burrowing down to China," one said. Another called out, "What happens when it rains, old man? You gonna swim to bed?" McCrae said nothing. He kept at his work, the steady rhythm of his spade against the soil, his only reply. He understood what they didn't. He'd seen how the plains burned. He'd seen lightning split the sky in July, strike the sagebrush, and send fire crawling for miles in a night. He'd seen men lose cabins, livestock, even families to the roaring wind-fed infernos that rolled over the grasslands like judgment itself. In the high country, you didn't build against the wind, you built with it. The earth was the only shelter that never betrayed you. Inside his dugout, the temperature held even through the wildest changes. It was warm when the snow came down, cool when the sun baked the plains. The clay walls drank the sound of the wind, turning the place into something close to peace. At night, he would sit on the dirt floor beside his fire, the light painting the low ceiling with smoke. His rifle hung above the hearth, his traps rusting quietly in a corner. He kept a journal of sorts, a habit learned from Jedediah Smith years ago, who had said a man should leave behind more than bones. The writing was crude, the spelling worse, but in it he recorded the changing seasons, the stars, and the slow decline of the old ways. August 12th, 1849. One entry read, "The ground so dry the grass breaks like glass under the horses' feet. Antelope gone north, dug the last layer of sod for the roof. Neighbors laugh, but they don't know the land." The hills around him bore scars of past fire. Blackened stumps rose from the sage like ghost sentinels, and the soil in places was still fine and gray with ash. The drought was coming again. You could taste it in the dust and see it in the color of the sunsets, red as forge fire. Some evenings McCrae would walk the ridgeline above his cabin, Elk-Horn handled knife hanging at his belt, hat pulled low against the glare. From up there he could see the wagons moving west, a white line of promise snaking toward Oregon. He could hear the faint ring of hammers from the valley where new settlers fenced off their claims and cut down the cottonwoods for cabins. The frontier was shifting westward with every mile of rutted wheel track, and he stood on its fading edge like a man watching the sea go out. Once he met a young farmer named Ames who came to borrow a pickaxe. The man was 30 years his junior and full of the kind of confidence only a man new to hardship could have. As they stood by the doorway of the dugout, Ames looked inside and shook his head. "Seems awful close in there," he said. "You don't get tired of the dark?" McCrae smiled faintly. "Spent near 20 winters in a lodge made of poles and hides. This here's palatial." "Still," Ames said, half laughing. "Don't seem natural, a man livin' under the ground." McCrae's eyes drifted toward the horizon, where the heat shimmered like water over the sage. "Ain't nothing natural about dying in fire neither," he said. Ames didn't have an answer for that. That night, as the wind rose and the dry grass whispered against the hill, McCrae sat by his hearth and listened to the earth breathe. The firelight caught the curve of the elk horns mounted over his doorway, relics of another life, another age. Outside, the stars wheeled cold and distant, the same stars that had guided him through 100 lonely mountain passes. He thought of Bridger, still alive somewhere to the west, and of Carson, already half a legend among the emigrants. He thought of the rendezvous that would never come again, of the trade that had bound men to rivers and snowfields now empty of traps. The wilderness had taught him how to live. Civilization, he suspected, would teach him how to die. But for now, the dugout held steady against the wind. The hill pressed close around it like an old friend. And when the coyotes began their singing on the far ridge, Elias Elk-Horn McCrae lifted his head, listening to the wild chorus that had once been the music of his youth. The land was changing, burning, and being born again, and he, the man beneath the hill, was not done watching. By the spring of 1850, the hills had turned the color of old bone. Snowmelt ran shallow in the creeks, and even the cottonwoods along the Popo Agie carried a tired, dusty green. The air itself seemed brittle, as if one spark could set the whole sky alight. Elias McCrae felt it in his bones, that same old prickle he'd known long ago before the prairie fires, when the land went still and every creature seemed to be holding its breath. He was mending a trap line near the creek one morning when he stopped to rest, looking out toward the horizon. The ridges were pale and silent. In his mind, the years folded back, decades of rivers, mountains, and snowfields, until he could almost smell the pine smoke of the Green River camps and hear the laughter of men who'd long since vanished into history. He remembered the winter of 27, the one they spent near South Pass. Bridger had been there young, wiry, with eyes like a hawk's, and Kit Carson too, though he was barely more than a boy. They had built a lean-to of pine boughs against the wind and trapped the frozen creeks for beaver. The pelts had come in heavy that year, thick and silver. For weeks they'd lived on nothing but boiled elk and the fat of the tail. McCrae had carried his traps across half the continent after that, from the Platte to the Snake, from the Yellowstone to the Great Salt Lake. He had fought crow thieves near the Big Horn and traded with the Blackfeet under the watch of old Baptiste de Roker. He had seen grizzly tracks big as a man's chest and rivers so cold they could strip the skin from your fingers. The wilderness had been his teacher, and its lessons were written in scars. But those days were gone. The beaver had vanished, and with them the free trappers replaced by emigrants, surveyors, and the long gray line of progress. Now the wilderness had turned into something quieter, lonelier. That was why he'd built the cabin into the hill. Not just for shelter, but to be near the only thing that hadn't betrayed him, the earth itself. One evening, as the sun fell red and fat behind the mountains, McCrae sat by the fire with his journal open on his knee. The paper was rough and yellowed, bound with cord and patched with scraps of old letters. He wrote slowly, spelling as he spoke. April 3rd, 1850. Dry season coming early. Saw smoke north of Sweetwater, but too far to tell if it's grass fire or settler clearing. Elk gone higher. Coyotes thick. He paused, the pencil trembling slightly in his hand. His eyes, deep-set and gray, wandered to the elk horns over the door. They were old now, bleached white, one tine broken. He thought about how easy it was for things to vanish out here. A man, a trail, a way of life. The mountains didn't care. They just watched. Outside, the wind picked up, stirring the grass. The smell of dust came, through the chinks of the log wall. McCrae rose, stepped outside, and looked toward the valley. A thin column of smoke drifted against the horizon, faint, distant, but steady. He knew that smell. Not cooking fires, not camp smoke, dry grass burning. He turned back toward the cabin and ran his hand along the earthen roof. Cool to the touch, solid. The settlers in the valley had mocked him for digging his home into the soil, but if the fires came again, and they would, this place would hold. The earth was slow to burn. He thought of Larpenteur's stories, the old trader who'd written of prairie blazes that swallowed whole camps. The fire moved as fast as a horse could run, Larpenteur had said, and the sky burned as if the sun had fallen. McCrae had seen it once himself, on the upper Missouri, lightning striking a sage flat, the wind catching flame and sending it rolling for miles, devouring everything alive. The smoke alone could kill a man before the fire even reached him. That night, the air stayed warm, restless. Coyotes yipped once and fell silent. Somewhere out beyond the hills, thunder muttered dry thunder, the kind that promised no rain. McCrae didn't sleep much anymore. The years had left him restless, his dreams full of rivers and faces he couldn't name. Sometimes he thought he heard the old calls from the rendezvous grounds, laughter, fiddle music, the voices of Crow women trading robes and meat. He would wake sweating, clutching his knife, and realize it was only the wind scraping across the hill. Once, long ago, he dreamed of going back east, of seeing Street. Louis again, or maybe Independence, where the traders gathered each spring. But when he'd finally reached the Missouri, years before, he found the city changed beyond knowing. The traders wore clean shirts. The talk was of railroads and gold in California, and nobody cared for a grizzled mountain man with no pelts to sell. So he turned back, westward, once more, to the only place that still made sense. In the morning, he fetched water from the creek and found it running lower than ever, just a silver thread over the stones. The frogs were gone, and even the willows along the bank drooped like beaten men. He could smell the dust before he saw it. Faint, sharp, metallic. It came from the south, borne on a wind too warm for spring. McCrae stood there a long while, watching the horizon. A hawk circled high overhead, its shadow passing over the black scars of old burn lines. He thought of the settlers down in the flats, the Ames family, the blacksmith, the woman with 3 children who'd planted corn where the soil was still thin with ash. They didn't know the land yet. They didn't understand how quickly it could turn against them. He did. And in that knowledge, old Elias McCrae found a kind of calm. He was part of the wilderness, still scarred, silent, waiting for the fire that was bound to come. That evening he lit his pipe and sat in the doorway of the dugout as twilight spread across the hills. The smoke from his pipe curled upward, joining the haze that hung low in the west. The horizon glowed faintly orange, not sunset now, but something else, something growing. The wind carried a dry hiss through the sage. McCrae watched, silent as the hill itself. The fire was coming, and the man beneath the hill was ready. By midsummer, the drought had worsened. The grass stood dry and brittle, breaking like glass under a boot heel, and the sky held a pale, pitiless glare that made even the hawks drift lower in search of shade. A man could taste the dust in his teeth, feel it gather behind his eyes. In that season of thirst, Elias Elk-Horn McCrae became something of a curiosity to the settlers of the basin, the old trapper who lived under the ground while the rest of them sweated above it. The valley had grown busy since the spring. Wagons had come in from Independence, their wheels rutted deep, into the trail that cut along the Sweetwater. Families built cabins in neat rows, hammered fences out of green pine, and turned the soil with plows that squealed like tortured metal. They were building a world McCrae had already seen die once before, a world that believed the wilderness could be tamed by measurement and muscle. To them, his sod-roofed dugout was a joke. One afternoon, McCrae rode down to the new settlement to trade for salt and a length of iron to mend his shovel. The general store was little more than a shack of rough planks and calico nailed over a window frame. A few men loitered out front, shirts open, their faces red from heat and whiskey. As he dismounted, one of them, a lank man with straw-colored hair, squinted at him and grinned. "Well, if it ain't the mole man himself," he said. "How's life in the underworld, McCrae? You sproutin' roots yet?" The others laughed. McCrae brushed the dust from his coat and tied his horse to the post. "Cooler than your cabin, I'll wager," he said evenly. Another man spat into the dust. "You dig yourself a grave early. You'll have less work to do when your time comes." McCrae met his gaze without smiling. "That's true for all of us," he said. "Only difference is, mine's ready." That quiet, steady tone, the kind born of long winters and near starvation, carried something the settlers didn't understand. The laughter died quick. McCrae tipped his hat and went inside to trade. Behind the counter stood a woman in a gingham dress, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her name was Mrs. Ames' wife to the young farmer who'd once borrowed a pickaxe and called McCrae's home a burrow. She was kind-eyed, though care had already drawn faint lines around her mouth. "Afternoon, Mr. McCrae," she said. "You keeping well up there on the ridge?" "Well enough," he said, "long as the hill holds." She nodded, wrapping the salt in brown paper. "You're wise to build into the earth. This wind feels wicked dry. My husband says we'll see fire before harvest." McCrae glanced through the open door at the horizon, where a faint shimmer bent the air. "Aye," he murmured. "Fire's been waiting longer than you've been here." By the time he rode home, the sun was low and the wind had shifted from the east. He could smell something sharp and acrid in it, not smoke yet, but the ghost of it, that scent the earth gives just before it burns. The prairie stretched endless around him, the color of tarnished gold. Here and there, black scars from old fires crossed the land like healed wounds. At the crest of the ridge, he paused and looked back. The settlement lay small and fragile against the vastness cabins, no bigger than dice scattered in the dust. Smoke from a few cook fires drifted straight up. No one down there saw what he saw, a faint red smear far to the west where the sky met the mountains. He watched it a long time, lips tight around his pipe. The next day, a government surveyor rode through the basin. His name was Lieutenant Charles Ransom, a lean, polite man from back east, sent from Fort Laramie to chart the land for future homesteads. He arrived at McCrae's dugout late in the afternoon, sweat-streaked and dusty. Ransom dismounted, studying the hillside curiously. "You livin' there?" he asked. McCrae nodded. "Best roof in Wyoming territory. Won't blow down, won't burn up." The lieutenant smiled. "An interesting notion. Never saw the like before. You've built yourself a natural bastion." "Call it what you please," McCrae said, offering him water. "It's kept me alive." The young officer took a drink, wiping his brow. "I'll mark it on the map," he said, half grinning. "McCrae's burrow, perhaps." McCrae chuckled softly. "Aye, mark it if you like. But if you ever come back through after a fire season, you'll find it still standin'. Can't say the same for the rest." The lieutenant's expression turned thoughtful. "You think we'll see fire soon?" McCrae looked to the horizon. The west wind had picked up again, carrying dust like smoke. "We always do." In the following weeks, the wind grew relentless. Day after day, it scraped across the plains, filling eyes and mouths with grit. Chickens went blind from it. The Ames boy came up one morning to beg for water. Their well had run dry, and McCrae let him fill 2 buckets from his spring. "You tell your pa to watch that southern rise," McCrae said, pointing to a far-off ridge where the grass shimmered unnaturally in the heat. "If the wind turns, that's where it'll start." The boy nodded, wide-eyed, and hurried away. By evening, a thin haze hung over the horizon again, the same dull orange glow that bled into the twilight. The settlers still laughed at his warnings, still called him the Mole Man, but McCrae had seen enough summers to know what was coming. The world dried out before it burned. It always did. That night, as he sat inside the cool earth of his cabin, the air outside shifted again, a restless sigh running through the sage. His firelight danced against the clay walls, painting them the color of old blood. He opened his journal, wrote just a few words, and closed it again. July 28th, wind west. Grass too dry to hold a shadow. Smell of thunder in the air, but no rain. The land is listening. Then he set down the pencil, leaned back, and let the silence of the hill press close around him. The fire began with thunder, the dry kind, the kind that growls across a cloudless sky like a warning no one listens to. For days the air had carried that brittle edge, the smell of dust and hot iron. Then, one afternoon, the wind died suddenly, as if the whole basin were holding its breath. The horizon trembled with heat, and a strange copper light settled over the land. Elias McCrae knew the sign. He stood outside, his dugout, eyes fixed westward. A faint smudge lifted against the sky, gray at first, then bruised red as the minutes passed. Smoke? He felt it before he smelled it, a vibration in the stillness, a heaviness that pressed on the lungs. Somewhere out there, lightning had struck dry sage, and the prairie had answered. By sundown, the smudge had grown into a wall. Down in the valley, the settlers noticed too late. The wind came back, sudden and wild, turning the sky into a furnace draft. Flames leapt from ridge to ridge, feeding on grass cured by months of drought. The sound was like nothing human, a roar that rolled over the plains, deep and steady as the ocean. McCrae saddled his old bay, Dusty, and rode down toward the Ames homestead. The heat met him halfway, a blast that made his eyes water. Smoke smeared the sun into a dull red coin. In the distance, he could see men beating at the ground with wet sacks, women hauling buckets from dry wells, children crying. But the fire moved faster than fear, a line of living flame racing with the wind, taller than a man, wider than a river. He found young Ames shoveling a trench around his cabin, his shirt plastered to his back with sweat. "You'll not stop it that way?" McCrae shouted over the wind. "The grass'll jump that ditch like it ain't there." Ames wiped his brow, eyes wild. "What are we supposed to do, McCrae? We can't run. The stock'll never make it." "Then get your folks up the ridge. Bring what water you've got and follow me." Ames hesitated. "To your hole in the hill?" "To the only thing that'll stand," McCrae said. "Move." They came in a ragged line, Ames, his wife, their 2 children, and a neighbor couple with a mule between them. Behind them, the sky boiled black and red. Cinders floated ahead of the fire like dark snow, lighting the grass even before the main blaze reached it. The heat grew unbearable. The air itself seemed to burn. McCrae led them, along a dry creek bed, smoke biting at their eyes. The dugout appeared at last, half hidden in the slope, a dark mouth in the earth. He threw open the door and herded them inside. "Down," he barked. "Keep low. Breathe through the cloth if you can." The children whimpered. Mrs. Ames clutched a Bible to her chest. Outside, the wind screamed. Then came the fire. It struck the hill like a storm wave, a wall of noise and light that seemed to suck the air out of the world. Inside, the dugout shook. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the air turned thick and heavy. McCrae pulled the door shut and dropped the iron latch into place. The only light came from the faint orange glow seeping through the cracks around the chimney stone. "Will it hold?" someone whispered. "It's held worse," McCrae said. But even as he spoke, the sound above them changed a deep, thunderous whoomph as the fire rolled over the ridge. The ground itself felt alive, trembling underfoot. He crouched near the hearth, hand on the cool earth wall, and whispered like a prayer. "Hold, old friend, hold fast." Time lost meaning inside the hill. The fire outside howled like a living thing, feeding on everything that dared to stand above ground. The air grew hot enough to burn skin, yet inside the dugout it stayed bearable, smoky, but survivable. McCrae kept the vent sealed with damp rags, opening it only now and then for a breath of fresher air when the wind shifted. At one point, a sound like cannon fire rolled through a tree, exploding from the heat. Sparks rattled down the chimney, hissing in the ashes. Mrs. Ames began to sob quietly, her husband holding her close. The mule outside screamed once, then fell silent. McCrae's eyes watered, though not just from smoke. He'd seen death before in the mountains, in the traps, in the jaws of winter, but this was different. This was the land devouring itself. When the noise finally began to fade, it was replaced by another sound, an eerie, hissing moan as the wind shifted direction and the fire passed east. The air inside cooled by slow degrees. McCrae lifted the latch and pushed the door open a crack. A wave of hot air rolled in, heavy with ash. He coughed, blinking into the gray light. The world outside was unrecognizable. The prairie was gone. What had once been gold and green now lay black and smoking. The sky hung low, streaked with soot. The sun looked pale and strange. Dead cattle lay in the creek bed, their hides blistered. The Ames cabin was nothing but a few upright posts, the rest a smoldering heap. McCrae stepped out cautiously. Beneath his boots, the earth still radiated heat. The grass was gone all the way to the horizon. Only the hill behind him stood unchanged, its sod roof scorched at the edges but unburned. The settlers stumbled out one by one, faces streaked with soot and disbelief. The Ames boy clung to his mother's skirts, staring wide-eyed at the ruins below. "It took everything," she whispered. "Everything we had." McCrae looked down the valley, the faint wind stirring flakes of ash like snow. "The land takes, same as it gives," he said quietly. "But she spares those who listen." Ames turned to him, hollow-eyed. "I laughed at you," he said. "I said no man should live like a mole. I was wrong." McCrae said nothing. He only looked toward the west, where the fire's trail still smoldered and touched the earth wall of his home as if greeting an old companion. The hill had kept its promise. That night, when the wind finally died, the basin lay under a strange silence. No crickets, no night birds, only the crackle of cooling embers. McCrae sat at the doorway of his dugout, his journal open on his knee, the stub of a pencil in his hand. August 2nd, 1850. Fire came like a tide, buried the land in ash. The house held. The hill saved them. He closed the book and looked out at the horizon, still faintly red in the dark. Somewhere far off. Thunder rolled again, softer this time, and blessedly wet. The first raindrops hissed as they struck the blackened earth, and Elias McCrae smiled for the first time in a long while. The land would live again. For 3 days after the fire, the sky stayed the color of pewter. Smoke clung low to the basin, turning every sunrise into a dull, red bruise that never quite healed. The air smelled of wet ash and burned sage. It coated the tongue, the skin, even the eyes. When the wind came, it didn't cool, it just moved the ghosts of the fire from one place to another. Elias McCrae worked in silence. He'd seen destruction before, avalanches in the Wind River passes, floods on the Platte, the slow dying of winter-starved horses, but this was worse because it had no shape, no mercy. It was as if the land itself had turned against its people. He spent the first morning walking the black fields with a shovel and a length of rope, helping bury what was left of the settlers' stock. The Ames family had lost everything but their lives. Their cabin was gone, the well filled with soot and debris, their fields nothing but char. The others fared no better. In all directions lay the same sight, smoking fence posts, twisted iron, and the gray outlines of things that had once been alive. When the last cow was covered, young Ames stood beside him, hat in hand. "If not for your hill," he said quietly, "we'd be part of this ash too." McCrae nodded but didn't answer. He didn't like thanks. It sat wrong in his gut. Survival wasn't a matter of cleverness or grace, it was just listening to the land when it spoke. Most folks never did. That night, the settlers gathered near the creek bed, the only place where a trickle of water still ran. They built a small fire from half-burnt timber and huddled around it like pilgrims in a new world. The flames danced weakly in the wind, casting long, thin shadows over the blackened ground. McCrae sat apart, on a flat rock, pipe in hand. His beard was streaked with ash, his shirt torn at the shoulder. The faces around the fire glowed dull orange, men, women, and children, with nothing left to their names but breath. Ames spoke for them all. "We'll rebuild," he said, though his voice carried no conviction. "The soil's still here. It'll grow again." McCrae took the pipe from his mouth and tapped it against his boot. "So it will," he said, "but the land'll have her say first. Don't rush her. Let her rest a spell." "Rest?" one man asked bitterly. "How's a man supposed to rest when there's nothing left to eat?" McCrae's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "You rest by learnin'. Fire don't just burn. It teaches. You build with the wind, not against it. You keep your well deep and your walls thick. The land gave warning before this. You all heard it, but didn't listen." No one answered. The truth was too raw to touch. Later that night, long after the fire's glow had faded, McCrae lay awake inside his dugout. The air was cooler now, heavy with dampness from the rain that had come and gone. He could hear the soft hiss of drops sliding down the chimney stones, smell the earth returning to itself. His thoughts wandered not to the living, but to the ones long gone. He saw again the faces of the trappers who had shared his winters. Bridger, Fitzpatrick, Beckworth men who'd walked into the teeth of blizzards and laughed. The world had burned them away too, only slower. Civilization had done to their kind what the fire had done to the prairie. He remembered one night in '28, deep in the Yellowstone country, when the snow had buried their camp and only the heat of the fire inside the lodge had kept them alive. The crow had taught him then how to breathe shallow in smoke, how to bank a flame low to survive the night. That knowledge, old, simple, half forgotten by the new settlers, had saved him again here. The wilderness had a long memory. It repaid those who respected it and punished those who mocked it. Sometime near dawn, McCrae rose and stepped outside. The world was still no sound but the slow drip of rain from charred branches. The stars were gone, hidden behind a ceiling of gray. In the distance, faint wisps of steam rose from the wet ash. It looked for all the world like the earth itself was breathing. He knelt, scooped a handful of the damp soil, and let it run between his fingers. Beneath the soot, it was already softening, dark and alive. "The land's not dead," he murmured. "Just sleepin'." He looked down toward the valley, where the settlers' campfire burned faint and lonely in the gloom. They would rebuild, he knew that. Men always did. But he also knew that few of them would ever truly understand what the fire had tried to tell them. Only the man beneath the hill had listened. That morning, when the first bird sang a lonesome sound against the gray, silence, McCrae smiled. The night without stars had passed, and though the world lay black and broken, it was still turning. When the first green blades pushed through the ash, Elias McCrae knew the land was keeping its promise. It started small shoots of fireweed and buffalo grass rising out of the black soil like cautious scouts. Within weeks, the basin shimmered faintly green again, thin as a whisper but alive. The settlers called it a miracle. McCrae called it the way of things. Fire, he knew, was never the end. It was the old wilderness clearing its throat, burning away what was weak so something stronger could grow. The buffalo had known that long before the white men came. The crow and the Blackfeet had known it too, setting their own fires to drive the herds and renew the grass. But the newcomers didn't listen to such old truths. They saw only destruction where the earth saw rebirth. Now, after the smoke and the silence, life was creeping back, cautious but determined. McCrae spent most days helping rebuild what could be rebuilt. The Ames family moved into a shelter near his dugout, its roof half sod and half plank, a compromise between the old ways and the new. The boy, Will, followed McCrae everywhere, eager to learn. "How do you know where to dig for a spring?" the boy asked one morning as they searched for a new water source. McCrae crouched, pressed his palm flat to the ground, and waited. "You listen," he said simply. "The earth talks to you, quiet-like. You feel it in your bones, same way you'd feel thunder before it breaks." Will frowned, mimicking the gesture. "Feels like dirt to me." McCrae smiled faintly. "Give it a few more years, boy. Dirt's all a man's got to learn from, in the end." By mid-autumn, The settlers had built new cabins, this time with wider chimneys and sod roofs, just as McCrae had shown them. They dug deeper wells, cleared fire breaks, and stacked barrels of water by their doors. The fire had made them humble, but also wiser. For the first time, they began to ask the old trapper's advice instead of mocking it. One evening, as the sky faded from copper to violet, young Ames and 2 other men came up the ridge to share supper. They brought venison and coffee, and the talk turned to plans, new crops, fences, the coming winter. "You ever think of moving east again?" Ames asked, stirring his cup. "Back to where there's towns, maybe a church, real roads?" McCrae chuckled low. "Son, I've seen what's east. It ain't my country anymore. The mountains and I came to an understanding a long while back. I don't leave, and they don't kill me." The men laughed softly, though there was something in his tone that kept them from pushing further. McCrae wasn't built for the settled world. He belonged to the spaces between maps, the quiet, untamed places that didn't yet have names. As the weeks passed, rain fell again, steady and cold. The river swelled, carrying away the last of the ash. Grass grew where the cabins had burned. Even the charred cottonwoods began to bud. But though the basin healed, McCrae could feel something shifting inside himself, a restlessness that no season could settle. He spent more time alone, walking the ridges, following the elk tracks north. He'd pause often to look down at the valley, a patchwork of new roofs, fenced fields, and curling smoke. Civilization creeping in again. He didn't resent it. It was the way of the world. Men built, nature burned, and both started over. But he knew he was nearing his own kind of winter. The fire had taken something from him, though he couldn't name it. Perhaps it was simply the last illusion that the wilderness would stay wild forever. One afternoon, a mail rider from Fort Laramie stopped by, a lean young soldier with dust on his boots and curiosity in his eyes. He handed McCrae a letter, a rare thing in that part of the world. The envelope was stained, the handwriting awkward and looping. It came from an old trapper comrade, one of Bridger's men, living now in Street Lewis. Inside was a single line: "They say the railroad's coming west." McCrae folded the letter slowly and looked toward the horizon. The idea of iron rails slicing through the wilderness felt like another kind of fire, one that wouldn't burn out. He tucked the letter into his journal and set it on the shelf beside the Elk-Horns. "Let it come," he murmured. "The land'll teach them too." That evening, when the settlers' lamps glowed like small stars in the valley below, McCrae sat outside his dugout, pipe smoke curling around his head. The prairie was quiet again, a different kind of quiet than before the fire, softer, almost forgiving. A coyote called in the distance, and another answered. The sound rolled through the hills, lonely but alive. McCrae smiled. The world had crawled out of the smoke, and so had he. By the winter of '53, the basin had changed so much that Elias Elk-Horn McCrae sometimes wondered if he'd dreamed the old days. The valley below his hill now held more than cabins. There was a blacksmith's forge, a schoolhouse of rough pine, and a trail worn deep enough to be called a road. Wagons creaked through every few weeks on their way west toward Oregon, their canvas tops glowing pale in the sunlight like ghosts drifting across the land. The wilderness was retreating, mile by mile, the way ice gives ground to a thaw. McCrae watched it happen with the calm of a man who'd seen too much to be surprised. Civilization had a smell all its own, smoke, iron, and sweat, and it clung to the air thicker each year. The settlers called the growing town Sweetwater Crossing. They built fences where once the buffalo ran, and their children played where fire had once swept clean. And yet, at the edge of all that order, the old trapper's dugout still stood half buried in the same hill that had saved them. The roof had settled lower, the logs dark with age, but it held fast. McCrae was older now, slower in the joints, his beard gone white as river foam. He spent his mornings splitting kindling and his afternoons whittling antler into knife handles for passing traders. Folks from town stopped by to buy them, though most came for the stories. To the younger ones, he was legend, the man who lived through the Firestorm. He'd smile when they asked him to tell it again. "Wasn't courage saved me," he'd say, poking at the embers in his hearth. "Just plain sense and the good earth." I listened when she spoke. "You'd best do the same." Sometimes they laughed, just as their fathers once had. But most left quieter than they came, glancing at the hill with a new sort of respect. One afternoon, a wagon rolled up bearing a small wooden crate marked Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal, Pinedale, Wyoming. It came from the Museum of the Mountain Man, though McCrae didn't know such a place by name. A young man, a scholar, they called him, stepped down, eager-eyed and pale, a city soul wrapped in frontier clothes. "Mr. McCrae," he said, "I've come to speak with you about the old days. I'm collecting accounts of the fur trade, the men who opened the West. There aren't many left." McCrae chuckled. "That's because most of 'em got opened right along with it." The scholar smiled politely. "I read your name once, a passing mention in Larpenteur's notes. You trapped with Bridger and Beckworth?" "Aye," McCrae said, settling into his chair. "And Smith, too, though not for long. He was a good man, too good for the world we made, carried a Bible in one hand, rifle in the other. The wilderness doesn't forgive that kind of balance." He told the young man what he could remember: the cold mornings on the Yellowstone, the roar of the Green River in flood, the smell of burning pine at the rendezvous camps. He spoke of hunger and solitude, of men who froze, fought, and laughed their way through a country that had no maps. By the time the story ended, the scholar's hands trembled slightly as he wrote. "Sir," he said, "you've seen more than most historians could dream." McCrae shrugged. "Ain't dreams that matter, son. It's what's left when the dreaming stops." The next morning, McCrae walked the ridge while frost still silvered the grass. The air carried that sharp, clean cold that made a man feel both alive and temporary. From the ridge, he could see the valley below, smoke rising from the chimneys, children's laughter carrying faintly through the stillness. He knelt and placed his hand on the ground, fingers pressing into the frozen sod. "You did fine," he murmured to the earth. "You burned, but you lived. You always do." It was hard not to see himself in that same way, scarred, enduring, still stubbornly holding to the last bit of wildness left in the world. That evening, young Will Ames, no longer a boy now, but a man with a wife and a newborn son, came to visit. He brought bread and venison, and together they sat by the fire. "They're naming the new postal stop after you," Will said with a grin. "McCrae's Hollow. Folks figure it's only right, seeing as your hill saved half the valley." McCrae laughed softly, shaking his head. "Names don't stick long out here, Will. The wind'll wear that off same as it does the paint on a wagon." "Maybe," Will said, "but the story will stay." McCrae looked into the fire, the flames flickering gold in his eyes. "Stories don't belong to men," he said. "They belong to the land. We just carry them for a while." Winter deepened. Snow came early and heavy, blanketing the scars of the old fire. The settlers' lights twinkled below, and from his doorway, McCrae watched them like stars scattered across a new sky. He wrote his final journal entry that December. "The hill still holds. The world has moved on. The wilderness is smaller, but she ain't gone, not yet." When spring came, the people of Sweetwater Crossing found his door open, smoke cold in the hearth, his journal on the table beside an Elk-Horn handled knife. They buried him in the hillside that had been his refuge, the same earth that had guarded him from the flames. Years later, travelers along the Oregon Trail would pause at McCrae's Hollow, reading the carved words on a weathered sign. "Here stood the man who lived beneath the hill. When the world burned, he listened and survived." And though the prairie wind had no memory for names, it carried the story just the same, whispering it across the sage and stone, the last echo of a mountain man who built his home in the heart of the earth and found his peace in the silence of the frontier.